Noah Grayson eased his truck onto the shoulder the moment he noticed the police car ahead, its hood raised and a thin ribbon of smoke drifting into the frozen December air. He told Sophie to keep her seatbelt on, then stepped out into the sharp wind. Gravel crunched beneath his boots, and at the sound, the officer turned. When she lifted her sunglasses, time seemed to stall. It was Brooke Ellison, the woman who had disappeared from his life 10 years earlier without a word. The woman whose absence had left scars he'd convinced himself were long healed. And now she was standing there, close enough to touch, while his 7-year-old daughter waited in the truck behind him, unaware that something had just cracked open. Brooke looked different, older, harder around the edges. Her posture was stiff, her face sharper in the pale winter light, but her eyes were unchanged. The same dark brown gaze, guarded and searching, studying him the way it used to when she was deciding how much truth to offer. She said his name softly, almost uncertainly, as if testing whether he would respond. Noah answered with a single nod, afraid that if he spoke, too much would come out. Behind him, Sophie shifted in her booster seat, humming off-key, grounding him in the present even as everything inside him threatened to pull him backward. The cruiser sat at an awkward angle on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking steadily as if trying to impose order on the moment. Noah forced himself to move, walking past Brooke toward the open hood. She stepped aside without a word, giving him space, like he was a stranger offering help instead of someone who had once known every version of her. Steam rolled up from the engine, and the problem revealed itself almost immediately. A split hose, clean and obvious. The kind of failure that should have been easy to deal with, the kind that usually didn't leave anyone stranded. But Route 12 was quiet in winter, and help took its time getting here. Brooke told him she'd already called for a tow. It would be at least an hour. She didn't ask him to stay, didn't ask him to do anything at all. She simply stood there with her arms crossed, watching him with a careful distance, like she was trying to remember where she'd seen him before. That look, detached, assessing, hit him harder than anger. After everything, she could look at him like he was just another passing face. He said he had a spare hose in his truck. The lie came easily, slipping out before he could stop himself. Standing there doing nothing felt worse than pretending he could fix it. Brooke thanked him, her tone neutral, professional, the voice of an officer used to keeping emotion contained. Noah noticed she wasn't wearing a wedding ring. The realization annoyed him, not because of what it meant, but because he'd looked at all. From the truck, Sophie's voice carried through the cold, asking if they could go home soon. Bright, impatient, innocent. Brooke turned toward the sound, and something shifted across her face. Not sadness exactly, more like recognition, or maybe the shadow of something lost. She asked if Sophie was his daughter. Noah said yes, nothing more. Brooke nodded slowly, as if the answer fit into a story she already knew, one the last 10 years had written without either of them speaking a word. Noah walked back to the truck and opened the door just long enough to lean inside. He told Sophie he needed to make a quick phone call, that they'd be back on the road soon. It was another easy lie, softened by a calm tone he didn't quite feel. Sophie peered past him toward the cruiser. "Is the police officer in trouble?" she asked. "No," Noah said, "just car trouble." That seemed to satisfy her. She nodded seriously, as if filing the information away. "That's okay then," she said. "Police officers help people, so it's good we're helping her back." The logic was simple and unguarded, the kind only a child could manage without resentment or history attached to it. Noah closed the door and stood there longer than necessary, staring at the truck bed as though the toolbox might magically produce the part he'd claimed to have. It didn't. His hands trembled as he pretended to sort through wrenches and loose bolts. Not from the cold, though the air cut sharply against his skin. This shaking came from somewhere deeper, stirred awake after years of careful routine and deliberate forgetting. He felt her before he heard her. Brooke stepped up beside him, quiet as a thought he didn't want. She asked if he was okay. The concern in her voice sounded real, and that made it worse. "I'm fine," Noah said. It was the easiest lie of the day. She didn't believe him. He could tell by the way her jaw tightened, just slightly, the way her eyes lingered on his face as if weighing whether to push further. Instead, she apologized for the inconvenience and told him again that he didn't need to stay, that the tow truck would come eventually. The words sat between them, polite and distant. Noah exhaled and admitted the truth. He didn't have a spare hose. The confession came out sharper than he intended, edged with frustration he wasn't ready to name. Brooke accepted it without reaction. She thanked him for stopping anyway, her voice steady. Then she asked if Sophie was his only child. The question landed heavier than it should have. Noah answered yes. Brooke nodded, slower this time, and looked back toward the truck where Sophie had pressed her face to the window, watching them with open curiosity. The wind swept across the fields beyond the road, carrying the scent of frozen earth and manure, sharp and familiar. For Noah, it was the smell of every winter he'd ever known, and the reminder that some things never really left you, no matter how far you thought you moved on. The drive back to the farm passed in a blur. Sophie hummed to herself, feet swinging lightly as if nothing unusual had happened, while Noah kept his eyes fixed on the road. The fields stretched out on either side, dull and brown beneath a low, gray sky. Normally, the sight steadied him. Today, it didn't. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the sun was already sinking, casting long shadows across the barn and the pasture. Sophie jumped out of the truck and ran ahead, calling for Margaret, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. Her laughter drifted back toward him, bright and effortless. Noah stayed where he was for a moment, one hand resting on the truck door. The cold air filled his lungs, sharp and grounding, but it didn't quiet his thoughts. The farm had always made sense to him. The work was demanding but honest, the days shaped by routines he could rely on. He had built a life here piece by piece, one that didn't ask him to revisit old wounds or unanswered questions. But Brooke's return had cracked something open. Inside the house, Margaret greeted Sophie, listening patiently as she launched into a story about the police officer with the broken car. Margaret nodded in all the right places, but her eyes lifted briefly and met Noah's. She didn't say anything, yet he could feel the unspoken question waiting. She had raised him after his parents died, and she knew him too well to miss the signs. She would sense the shift before he ever found the words for it. Noah hung his coat by the door and went upstairs to change. His room was unchanged, plain, practical, overlooking the south pasture where the land rolled out quiet and familiar. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor, trying to sort through the weight pressing against his chest. Brooke was back in Oakage. That single fact overshadowed everything else, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't figure out where it fit in the life he had so carefully built. Dinner passed with the kind of normalcy Noah usually depended on. Sophie talked through every bite, jumping from school stories to plans she had for the weekend. Margaret listened, smiling when appropriate, asking gentle questions. From the outside, nothing was different. But Noah felt the weight of Margaret's awareness settling in. She didn't interrupt. She didn't probe. She waited the way she always had, patient, observant, letting silence do the work. When Sophie finally wandered off to her room, humming as she went, Margaret cleared the table slowly and poured Noah a cup of tea. She sat across from him, hands folded, studying his face the way she had when he was a boy trying to hide a scraped knee. "I know who she is," Margaret said quietly. Noah didn't ask how. In a town like Oakage, history lingered whether you invited it or not. Margaret remembered everything, especially the things people pretended were gone. She said Brooke's return must be difficult. Noah dismissed it quickly, saying it didn't matter, that 10 years was a long time and people moved on. The words sounded rehearsed, like something he'd told himself more than once. Margaret didn't argue. She just looked at him with calm certainty, the kind that made denial feel thin. After a moment, she asked a single question, soft but deliberate. "Are you protecting Sophie?" she said, "or are you protecting yourself?" The question stayed with him long after he finished his tea. He went upstairs without answering, but it followed him into the quiet of his room, settling into the spaces he'd tried so hard to keep sealed. That night, sleep refused to come. Noah lay staring at the ceiling, the house quiet around him, until memory crept in without warning. 12 years earlier, on the eve of Brooke leaving for college, they had driven out to the lake at the edge of town. Late summer still clung to the air, warm but edged with the first hint of fall. They'd parked near the water and climbed onto the hood of his truck, backs resting against the windshield, watching the sky darken as stars appeared one by one. Brooke had been unusually quiet. Noah assumed it was nerves, the weight of leaving everything familiar behind. He told her it would be fine, that distance didn't matter if two people wanted the same future. He said they'd make it work. She turned to him then, her face serious in the dim light, studying him as if she were deciding whether to believe him. Finally, she said she did. She promised she'd come back whenever she could, that Oakage was still home, that he was still home. He kissed her, tasting the cherry chapstick she always wore, her hair soft beneath his fingers. She kissed him back with an urgency that caught him off guard, like she was trying to memorize every detail. Before they left the lake, Noah told her he would wait, no matter how long it took. Brooke promised she would return. She made a lot of promises that night. At the time, Noah had believed every single one of them, because he didn't yet know how easily promises could break. The memory faded as quickly as it had come. Noah blinked, alone in the quiet room, the past retreating but not gone. Down the hall, Sophie laughed in her sleep, the sound light and untroubled. She didn't know the history tied to Brooke's name. To her, Brooke was just a police officer with a broken car. Maybe, Noah thought, that was all she ever needed to be. Noah saw Brooke again, 3 days later at the farmer's market. Saturday mornings in Oakage followed a familiar rhythm. He brought Sophie into town to pick up feed, then let her choose something sweet from the baked goods table, a small tradition neither of them ever skipped. It was simple, predictable, the kind of routine that asked nothing from him except presence. He was turning past the vegetable stalls when he spotted her. Brooke stood near the honey vendor, holding a small jar up to the light, examining it with quiet focus. She noticed him at the same moment he noticed her. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved, the noise of the market fading into the background. Then Sophie tugged on his hand and asked if they could get cinnamon rolls. The moment broke. Brooke set the jar down and walked toward them, her stride steady and deliberate. She wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a dark jacket, but Noah still caught sight of the badge clipped at her belt. It was subtle but unmistakable. The way she moved carried the same authority, the same awareness. She greeted Sophie first, crouching down to her level and asking her name. Sophie answered without hesitation, open and trusting, telling Brooke about the cinnamon rolls and how her dad always let her pick two if she promised to share one with Margaret. Brooke smiled, carefully, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to, and said that sounded like a fair deal. Noah stayed silent, watching the exchange with something tight and unfamiliar pressing against his chest. When Brooke straightened and looked at him, her expression was neutral, controlled. She said it was good to see him again. He didn't reply. He told Sophie they needed to keep moving, that Margaret would be waiting at home. Sophie waved enthusiastically as they walked away, and Brooke lifted a hand in return. They headed back toward the truck, back toward distance. But as Noah knew too well, distance never lasted long in a town as small as Oakage. Noah saw Brooke again, 3 days later at the farmer's market. Saturday mornings in Oakage followed a familiar rhythm. He brought Sophie into town to pick up feed, then let her choose something sweet from the baked goods table, a small tradition neither of them ever skipped. It was simple, predictable, the kind of routine that asked nothing from him except presence. He was turning past the vegetable stalls when he spotted her. Brooke stood near the honey vendor, holding a small jar up to the light, examining it with quiet focus. She noticed him at the same moment he noticed her. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The noise of the market fading into the background. Then Sophie tugged on his hand and asked if they could get cinnamon rolls. The moment broke. Brooke set the jar down and walked toward them, her stride steady and deliberate. She wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a dark jacket, but Noah still caught sight of the badge clipped at her belt. It was subtle but unmistakable. The way she moved carried the same authority, the same awareness. She greeted Sophie first, crouching down to her level and asking her name. Sophie answered without hesitation, open and trusting, telling Brooke about the cinnamon rolls and how her dad always let her pick two if she promised to share one with Margaret. Brooke smiled, carefully, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to, and said that sounded like a fair deal. Noah stayed silent, watching the exchange with something tight and unfamiliar pressing against his chest. When Brooke straightened and looked at him, her expression was neutral, controlled. She said it was good to see him again. He didn't reply. He told Sophie they needed to keep moving, that Margaret would be waiting at home. Sophie waved enthusiastically as they walked away, and Brooke lifted a hand in return. They headed back toward the truck, back toward distance. But as Noah knew too well, distance never lasted long in a town as small as Oakage. The following Tuesday, Brooke showed up at the farm. Noah was repairing a rotted section of fence near the barn when he saw the cruiser pull into the driveway. His stomach sank, the same heavy drop he'd felt on the road days before. He wiped his hands on his jeans, forcing his expression into a neutral mask, and walked toward her. Brooke stepped out of the cruiser and spoke before he could say a word. There had been reports of livestock theft in the area, 3 farms in the past 2 weeks, all within 10 miles. The department was checking in, making sure everyone secured their barns and stayed alert. She delivered the information as though it were routine, as though she hadn't specifically chosen to come here. Noah listened without interrupting, keeping his voice even. "I'll make sure the barn is locked," he said. Brooke nodded, thanked him, but didn't leave. Her gaze drifted past him toward the pasture, where the cows clustered near the water trough. "This place looks good," she said quietly. "You've done well." Noah didn't know how to respond, so he stayed silent. Brooke turned back toward her cruiser, but paused, looking at him seriously. "Have you ever thought about leaving?" she asked. The question hit him off guard. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. "Leaving Oakage, the farm, all of it, ever wanted somewhere else," she clarified. Noah shook his head. "No, this is where I belong." She studied him for a long moment, then said softly, "I'm glad one of us figured that out." And just like that, she got back into the cruiser and drove away, leaving Noah in the driveway with a wrench in his hand, unsure what she had truly been asking. Later that night, Margaret found him alone in the kitchen. Sophie was asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet except for the tick of the clock. She poured him a cup of tea and sat down across from him, her hands folded neatly on the table. "I saw her today," she said softly. "Brooke, I know who she is." Noah didn't ask how she knew. She had always seen more than anyone else. Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Her return, it must be difficult for you." "No," Noah said quickly. "It doesn't matter. 10 years have passed. People move on." Margaret didn't argue. She watched him with a calm patience that made evasion feel impossible. After a pause, she asked quietly, "Noah, are you protecting Sophie, or are you protecting yourself?" The question lingered long after she left, settling into the silence of his room like a weight he couldn't shake. A few days later, Noah and Sophie were at the hardware store picking out supplies for the irrigation system. Sophie was distracted by the color samples in the paint aisle when Brooke appeared, this time in uniform. She greeted Sophie first, kneeling down to her level. Sophie's face lit up immediately, and she told Brooke about the cinnamon rolls, about how her dad always let her pick one too if she promised to share with Margaret. Brooke smiled softly and handed Sophie a small plastic badge, the kind given to children at community events. "An honorary deputy badge just for you," she said. Sophie's eyes widened in delight, and she thanked Brooke over and over, clutching the badge like treasure. Noah watched silently. For the first time in weeks, he felt the walls he'd built start to tremble. Brooke glanced at him, asking without words the same question she had asked at the farm. Could he let her in? This time, he didn't look away. Over the next 2 weeks, Brooke became impossible to ignore. She was at the diner when Noah stopped for coffee. She drove past the farm while he worked in the fields. She was everywhere, and he couldn't tell if it was coincidence or something deliberate. He tried to avoid town whenever possible, taking longer routes home and skipping the farmer's market. But Oakage was too small, and Brooke was too present. One night, Noah was repairing a fence behind the barn when headlights swept across the field. Brooke stepped out of her cruiser, flashlight in hand, and asked if everything was all right. He reassured her he was fine. She stayed, her presence quiet but insistent until she spoke again. "I owe you an explanation," she said. Her voice was steady, but something in it strained against years of silence. Noah shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do," Brooke said. "I left without telling you why, and that was wrong. I was pregnant when I left." The words struck Noah like ice. She explained how terrified she had been, how she discovered the pregnancy only after he had proposed over the phone, how she lost the baby before she could face him. Fear and youth had guided her choice to leave. Noah felt the world tilt beneath him. Noah remembered the coffee shop 3 years before when he had driven to propose to Brooke. She had smiled, said yes over the phone, and he had felt unstoppable. But in the shop, she had returned the ring, shaking her head silently, eyes red but dry, and walked away. He had waited in the parking lot for hours, hoping she would change her mind. She didn't. The memory made his hands clench the fence posts behind the barn. The old wound had never truly. A few days later, Noah heard from someone at the feed store that Brooke had been offered a promotion, a move to lieutenant in the city. His chest tightened. Of course she would leave again. That was what she always did, build, then walk away. He buried himself in farm work, staying out until dark, forcing himself to feel numb. Then Brooke surprised him. She turned down the promotion. She was staying. "I'm not running anymore," she told him. "Oakage is where I need to be. Not because of you, but because it's the only place I've ever felt like myself." Noah didn't know how to respond. He tried to warn her to argue, but she wasn't asking for permission. She was telling him. Margaret confronted him quietly later. "You've been a good father, a good man," she said, "but Sophie needs more than safety. She needs to see you take a risk, to show her that love is worth the possibility of pain." Noah shook his head. "I don't know if I can do that." "I think you can," Margaret replied, "but you have to choose for yourself." Brooke returned, unannounced, in jeans and a jacket. She said she wasn't asking for forgiveness or trust. She just wanted him to know she wasn't leaving, not for a promotion, not for anything. She had made the wrong choice 10 years ago, but now she could stay, show up, and face the hard parts. Noah realized, for the first time, she wasn't asking for a second chance. She was offering one. Noah invited her inside for coffee. Brooke sat at the table with Sophie and Margaret, answering questions about police work, the cruiser, and whether she had ever caught a criminal. She was patient, kind, and Noah realized his fear wasn't that she would leave. It was that she would stay, and he'd have to let her. After the coffee was ready, Noah placed a cup in front of her. Sophie asked if Brooke could visit again, and Noah said yes. Alone, Noah and Brooke sat quietly, sipping coffee. "Do you think it's worth trying?" she asked. He stared at the fields outside the window, then said slowly, "I don't know, but I'm willing to find out." 3 months passed. Brooke became part of the farm in small, gradual ways, helping with repairs, sitting with Sophie while Noah worked, becoming part of the rhythm of their lives. She didn't rush or push. Walls Noah had built for a decade began to crumble. Sophie adored her. Margaret approved quietly. Noah found himself looking forward to her visits, to small conversations, to the moments their hands brushed without thought. It wasn't perfect. The past still cast shadows, but more days than not, it felt right. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Noah and Brooke sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the fields. She leaned against his shoulder. He let her. The weight of it felt grounding, familiar. He thought about love, how it demanded risk, trust, and the willingness to be hurt again. Maybe that was the point, not to avoid the pain, but to embrace the chance at something real. Noah looked at the life he'd built. Now it wasn't just his. It was theirs, fragile, uncertain, but growing stronger every day. And for the first time in years, that was enough.